All right, so it is 1 o'clock. So welcome everyone to the final session of the SuccessWorks Badgers on Track Summer Workshop Series. Today we're going to be talking about virtual interviewing with confidence. If you were not expecting that, if you're not in the right place, that's okay, you're welcome to stay. Again, we will be recording this and presenting it later, so if you have follow-up questions afterwards, you'll be able to access this information or reach the SuccessWorks staff from there. First things first, what is SuccessWorks? If you haven't heard of us before, we are the Center for Personal and Professional Development in the College of Letters and Sciences. We specialize in everything career related, and our advisors are available for virtual appointments all summer long and into the fall as well. You can make an appointment with us. You can also talk to us about any questions you might have in your job search process, making connections, working on your resume or cover letter, mock interviews and practice. We also do offer courses, events, and workshops throughout the year. So definitely check us out after this presentation if you haven't done so. There's a lot going on at SuccessWorks. Today, we are going to talk about, like I said, virtual interviewing with confidence. So we'll start by introducing our moderators today. My name is Beth Carabin. I am the one of the career and internship specialists at SuccessWorks, and my focus is assisting students with an interest in the areas of business and entrepreneurship. We'll also have Devin and Amy chime in here to introduce themselves.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. Hello, everyone. My name is Devin Deegan. I'm also a career and internship specialist with SuccessWorks, and I work with students who are interested in communications, entertainment, and the arts.
All right, hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all so much for attending our session for today. My name is Amy Yang, and I'm one of the career and internship specialists who supports the career community, technology, data, and analytics.
Awesome. So, a couple things to orient yourself to the presentation. This is designed to be an interactive presentation, and there are going to be a couple of icons that indicate when we'd like you to participate. The pie chart symbol is going to indicate that we're going to have a poll that you'll be able to participate with. The poll will pop up on your screen when we start it, so when that happens, just go ahead and select your answer. We also are going to have spots where you can drop answers or thoughts in the chat box. If you haven't found the chat box yet, on the right side of the screen, down at the bottom, you'll see a little icon that's a speech bubble. You can click on that, and it will bring you to the general chat where you can go ahead and drop messages. We will be taking questions closer to the end of the presentation. We have a special guest today that will be helping us with questions. So if you do have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat during the presentation, but know that we are going to be having a Q&A session at the end. If you have issues in the meantime, you can reach out to Devin or Amy. Amy will be watching the chat, and so if you have problems or need anything right away, definitely let her know. And you can do that by clicking on the button next to the chat bubble. It says attendees. It's got the little people on it. Click on that, find Amy at the top, and click the little minus sign next to her if you'd like to message her directly. That'll pull up an option to send a chat message directly to her. All right. Oops. So first, let's finishing with the getting started. I'd like you all to actually test that direct message function and send me your email address. We're going to use that to keep track of who was able to attend today. So if you can do that today, or do that right now, go ahead and send Amy your email address. We're also going to pull up our first poll question while you're sending out those email addresses. With the question, how many employer interviews have you had so far? If you've had none, 1 or 2, 3 or 4, or a lot of interviews. And this is just we're going to have a couple questions to kind of gauge where our group is at today in terms of experience and comfort level with the stuff we're going to talk about. So don't forget to send Amy your email address, of course. We want to make sure that we know that you were here. And we have just a couple people still putting in responses. I think that we can go ahead and reveal those answers. Yeah, so it looks like we've got a pretty broad range of experience with us today. Some people haven't had any interviews or have only had a couple. Some have had a lot of interviews. The good news is that you can always improve with interviewing. So I'm glad that we have people from all areas of experience coming to join us today. What we're going to talk today is what you see here. We're going to talk about why interviews matter, aside from the obvious. We'll talk about types of interviews and how to prepare for them. We'll talk about types of questions you might expect and how to follow up with an interview. And then finally, like I said, the second half of this presentation will be a Q&A with Alicia Willman, who is a UW alumnus and works in HR and recruiting. So she'll be our voice from the real world to talk about our topic today. All right, like I said, we're going to do a few more poll questions just to get a feel for where we're at. So let's pull up the next poll. What is your current status? Are you interviewing for jobs? Are you still sending out applications? Are you thinking about grad school? Or do you have other things that you're focusing on right now that you want to focus on interviewing? I'll go ahead and have folks put in their answers. Right. Just waiting for a few more answers to come in here. Why don't we? Okay, it looks like waiting for authorization for employment is part of that too. And that's also a good time to be thinking for the future. So I'm glad that you're here to practice interviewing as well. Why don't we go ahead and reveal those results now? Great. So it looks like a lot of people are still sending out those applications. So I'm glad to see that people are thinking forward. Again, it's never too late, never too early to start practicing for interviews and thinking about how to approach them. The next one will be, how comfortable are you with interviewing? Those who have had a few interviews, if you've only had a couple, if you've had a lot, tell us how comfortable you feel with the process. Not at all comfortable, so-so, you feel like you're missing some things, you feel pretty comfortable, or you feel very comfortable that you could do a mock interview right now, not even a problem. Why don't we go ahead and state our comfort level? Yeah, all right. We have a few more coming through. Let's see here. All right, we have a few more answers coming through. Like someone is developing their resume as well. Again, we're going to talk a little bit about framing our thoughts, which can help with the resume carrying through to an interview as well. Why don't we reveal those responses now? Most people feel pretty comfortable, so-so, feel like we're missing things. So that's good. I'm glad that we're all here to talk about the process. I hope the tips today will help give you a little more confidence when it comes to interviewing. The last question here, what interviewing topic do you hope to learn more about today? We're going to talk about a lot of topics, but primarily preparing for interview, types of interview questions and how to answer them, how to connect my skills to the position, or interview follow-up and thank you letters. Go ahead and answer with that poll, and we'll see kind of where people are at with areas of interest. Right, still getting some answers filtering in here. Looks like we have a few left. I'd like to see just a couple more responses. Excellent. So there's another idea here too. Adapting interview skills from in-person to online is exactly what this presentation is going to focus on today. We're going to focus mostly on virtual interviewing because that's the most common thing right now. And yeah, that's great, Kelly. We're going to hit on all of these. So let's show the response. Most people have questions about types of interview questions, but we also have some interest in prepare the interview and how to connect skills to the position. So again, the good news is that we will be hitting on all of those things. Okay, so let's get into it. Why do interviews matter? Aside from the obvious, I want a job and I have to interview to get a job. The purpose of an interview is to demonstrate your qualifications, personality, and experience to the interviewer. It's where we show them who we are with our personality and what we're good at, what we're proud of. It's also where you discover if you are interested in this job by learning more about the company, the job itself, and how it aligns with your personal goals. That's something that's really important to keep in mind, is that as much as you are auditioning for the job in the interview, the job is also, in a way, auditioning for your interest. In a nutshell, interviews are where we demonstrate who we are in order to take on new challenges. In a way, it's where our present meets our future. Right. So we'll talk about types of interviews for starters, and we'll move through these pretty quickly because I want to focus on virtual interviewing today. So first, we'll talk about phone interviews, which are what they sound like. It's a phone interview where you're just going to be talking to someone on the phone. So the biggest challenge with a phone interview is that lack of face-to-face connection. It's easier to get distracted when you don't have a face to focus on. So the biggest way to overcome that challenge is to remove all distractions and be prepared. It's good to find a quiet room and inform your friends or your family or your roommates to give you some quiet time while the interview is taking place. Make sure you shut pets out of the room so there's no distractions. And taking notes is a great way to keep focus on the conversation. This is true for all interviews, but especially with a phone interview in particular. Another thing that sounds silly, but I want to make sure to mention it because it actually makes a huge difference, is to smile through the phone when you talk to someone. It sounds silly, like I say, but it actually does make a big difference. People can tell. The next type of interview is pre-recorded interview. These are becoming more common, especially in fields with lots of applicants. In a pre-recorded interview, you're given a prompt and are asked to give an answer to a video camera. The challenge here is that you lack even the feedback of a phone interview. You're not even interacting with someone in person. It's all recorded. The good news, though, is that you can choose the conditions that you interview in. With a pre-recorded interview, you want to make sure to follow the directions carefully. Interviews of this type will often have requirements about how many times you can try an interview or what they want you to answer. Make sure you follow those closely. You don't want to miss your chance to give a really good impression. At SuccessWorks, we use a tool called Big Interview, which is a pre-recorded interview platform. You can use that to actually do pre-recorded interviews, but you can also use it to practice pre-recorded or video interviews because it's a very similar setup and you'll get similar prompts. And you can use the video afterward to get feedback on your presentation from yourself or from a SuccessWorks advisor. So definitely take advantage of that if you're feeling like you need a little bit of practice. Next is in-person interviews, which again are what they sound. They used to be the standard before the pandemic. They're unlikely to go away. Some companies do still do some in-person interviews sometimes, but in general, they're not as common anymore due to obvious constraints. If you have the opportunity to do an in-person interview, it's often a good way to do that. Good thing to do because that in-person interview is going to give you the closest connection to the person you're talking to. It also will give you a chance to see the office that you'd be working in. Again, not as common that you see these come out nowadays, but if you get the chance to do it, definitely go. Which brings us to our flagship topic today, virtual interviewing. Just like this presentation, a lot of our interviews now are over video medium. There are a lot of challenges and opportunities that come up with the virtual interviews, and I want to talk how you can prepare for those and be ready. The first, of course, is technical difficulties. At this point, we've all been on video calls where the audio drops out mysteriously, or our bandwidth is kind of spotty, so our signal is grainy. With a virtual interview, what you want to do is test your technology before the interview and test it again. It's always good to make sure that it's working before the actual interview. So test it with yourself, test it with a friend to make sure the connection's going through. When you're in the interview, if something goes wrong, stay cool. This is your opportunity to show your composure under pressure to the interviewer. You can also have a backup plan in case something goes wrong. Often video interview platforms will have a dial-in option. So keep that handy and keep your phone nearby just in case something goes wrong and you need to dial in. Another challenge with virtual interviewing is you're interviewing in your home, often in your apartment, maybe in your living room or your bedroom. So how do you create a professional environment so that you look your best in the interview? And the answer to that is to design your interview set. It's a really good opportunity to kind of bring your personality and your professional tone to the way that your interview presents. To keep in mind as you are setting up your camera, light from behind the camera, not behind you. Position your camera at eye level so that you're looking straight at the camera. Use a blank or non-distracting backdrop. Make sure there's not movement or too much distracting items behind you. If some video platforms do have an option for a digital background, if you use a professional digital background, make sure it's professional. Definitely don't want to have the bridge of the Starship Enterprise or a sunny beach behind you while you interview for that first position. So keep that in mind. Just like with phone interviews, make sure you remove distractions, friends, family, pets. Don't want your dog popping up right in the middle of the interview. He's not interviewing, you are. Finally, professional low-key dress. Look the part. I actually recommend dressing all the way in professional outfits. A lot of people will just put on a nice top or a jacket or something like that. Try to avoid using pajama pants if you can, because that's going to help you get in the mindset of being that professional that you want to be. So we're going to a little game here. We're going to play this or that. So we're going to pull up the poll function, and I'm going to have you guys choose which of these two pictures you think is the stronger video interview presentation. Go ahead and pick. All right, looks like we definitely have a favorite. Why don't we reveal those answers? And it looks like photo one was the best, and that's right. The bottom one, he's got the lighting behind him. That's what happens when you backlight yourself. So again, be careful that your lighting is from behind the camera, not from you, not behind you. You want the interviewer to see your face. Let's do another one of these. How about 1 or 2? Which do you like better? All right, we're seeing those answers come in. Why don't we show the results? And again, photo 2 is the clear winner. And the problem with photo 1 is his camera isn't aligned with his eyes. We get a great view of his ceiling, but his ceiling isn't interviewing. We want to see the interviewer wants to see you, not the ceiling. So again, keep that. If you need to boost the camera with books or boxes, definitely do that. Whatever it takes to get it at eye level. Let's do one more. Which one do we like better, 1 or 2? All right, we're seeing those answers come through. Why don't we show the answer now? Photo 1. Yeah, number 2 actually is a professional backdrop that he created for himself. The professional backdrop might be better than what's behind you, but that backdrop is pretty distracting. There's a lot going on, a lot of distracting elements, especially for someone who might be interested in football. Again, focus on yourself, not the background. Right. The other challenge with virtual interviewing is making that personal connection. Just like with a phone interview, you aren't interacting with the person directly. The way to make that personal connection is to really be prepared and be organized on the video interview. Be prepared with your employer research questions that you have for the employer and your own resume, so that if you need to refer to your work history, you can. Use your notes, but don't read or focus on them. Try to keep them quiet and out of place, but you can refer to them if you need to. Practice your answers beforehand. We talked about big interview as a practicing method. You can also make an appointment with the folks at SuccessWorks, the advisors, to do a mock interview with a live person if you would prefer as well. Finally, enthusiasm and visible body language is a really good way to demonstrate engagement in an interview. Your challenge is kind of making that bridge through the video interview. So using gestures, interacting with folks, using their names, trying to make eye contact when you can, as best you can, focusing on your camera instead of the photos is a good way to do that. All right, so next, Devin is going to talk to us about preparing for the day of the interview.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. So on the day of the interview, as Beth mentioned, you should have your background research and any questions that you want to ask the company or ask the employer with you and ready and completed by the interview day. On the day of the interview, as Beth mentioned, again, you're going to want to make sure that you dress for success and really look your best. What's considered appropriate job attire can really vary by industry and location. So doing some background research about this as well, about what is standard for this job or company you're interviewing with, can make a world of difference as well. Make sure that the outfit that you pick is clean and fits you well. It's also important to know where you're going and who you're meeting with to help make sure that you arrive at your interview calm and on time, which is typically about 10 to 15. It's also important to know the time zone. So if you're interviewing in a different part of the country or maybe different part of the globe. It's important to know what time that you need to be ready for your virtual interview. If you aren't familiar with the technology the company is using for the virtual interview, you may even want to practice logging on a day or two in advance, just to make sure you don't encounter any surprises along the way. When your interview day does come up, make sure to bring a few copies of your resume and any other important documents you may need, for example, any references or portfolio that you might reference. It's also important to bring a pen as a way to take notes during the interview about what you chatted about. It's also helpful to silence your cell phone during a virtual interview and put it away to minimize disruptions to help you stay focused during your interview. It's totally normal to be nervous when you're meeting a potential employer, but we want to give you a few tips and tricks that you can do to avoid showing just how nervous you may be. Make sure you avoid playing with your hair, touching your face. Make sure to sit up straight or stand up straight if you're standing, and then greet everyone on the virtual interview with a smile. If you do have multiple interviews in a day, just do your best to try to remember names, faces, and titles of individuals, just so you can ask them directed questions or follow up with them individually.
Excellent. Now we'll talk about preparation. We've touched on this a little bit and how it's very important to prepare for a job interview. It's sort of like doing reconnaissance before going into a new place. Before you go on a journey, you review your map, check the weather, decide what things you want to see, and plan for backup emergencies. You should do the same for a job interview. After all, it's new territory for you. So first, let's talk about company research. Why do research? Well, to understand the company that we want to join. Researching the company will give you the info that you need to prepare your answers and your own questions. It also impresses the interview when you already know the basics of the company. Who doesn't like being noticed and appreciated, right? So what should we research? What should we look for when we do this employer research? Why don't we drop some ideas in the chat box? If you have any ideas, you can go ahead and just throw them in there right now. We can kind of crowdsource where we should start and what we should think about. If we're feeling stumped, oh, there we go. Company values and mission statement, definitely. Philosophy and mission, exactly. A lot of employers will ask about the company mission or allude to it in the interviews. You don't want to be caught unawares with that. Current projects and future projects, excellent. So we know what we're doing. Position expectations, excellent. What are we going to be asked to do in the job specifically? Let me see. All right, some other ideas. Company news. What's been going on with the company lately? Any new announcements or training or new programs being started? What products and services they offer? Make sure you know what the company's about. Sometimes people get tripped up with that. Industry trends, industry jargon, so that you know what's going on in the industry that you're looking to join and can talk to the interviewer about those projects in a little more detail. It's also, you can look at current and prior employees' histories and skills to understand what kinds of people succeed and live at this company. You can also do research on their hiring process. Sites like Glassdoor and Salary.com will give you some insight into salary trends, prior reviews on the company from people who worked there, and also can sometimes give you some insight into the questions that you might be asked in the interview. Products, how the company started, excellent. Learn about the history of the company and where they came from so you can ask where they're going. LinkedIn is a great place to look at employers, to look at current employees of the company and to understand how the company presents themselves in a social sense. You can also ask alumni connections. You can find those through SuccessWorks. We do a lot of work with our alumni to make sure that we know what's going on in the industry, and we can sometimes connect you with someone who has been at that company. And of course, don't neglect the company's website. Make sure that you know the basics of the companies, what they do and who they are, so that you aren't caught in that interview unawares. Sometimes we get asked questions in an interview that we don't have an answer for. Either we don't know or the answer is no. It's okay to give an I don't know answer, but try to turn every interview question into the opportunity that it is. Don't waste it by giving a non-answer like I don't know. Be honest about your limitations. If you aren't familiar with something or you haven't worked with it, it's okay to admit that you haven't, but try to turn that negative into a positive. You can acknowledge the weakness and offer transferable skills, which we'll talk about in just a second, or specific examples of past hurdles that you've overcome that illustrate your qualifications to that question. Most of all, again, demonstrating positivity and high energy and an eagerness to take on new challenges is really important in an interview. There will always be things that you don't know, and that's okay. But what matters more is your eagerness to undertake those new things and become more familiar with them. We touched on transferable skills, and what are those? Transferable skill is a skill that can be used in a variety of careers or situations. Some examples are here. They're often found in almost every single job. Every job is going to need somebody with good problem solving, or an ability to take initiative, or to have good attention to detail or leadership. So think about these in the context of other things that you've done in your work, in your experience, in your over life. In prepping these, what you can do is read the job description carefully and try to connect your experience to those job duties, either with hard skills, directly applicable, or transferable skills. Ask yourself the question, when have I demonstrated the skills that this employer is looking for this requirement? These can come from education, personal projects, work experience, or volunteering at this point. You all have a lot of experience in various areas of life, and make sure that you use specific examples to illustrate the kind of things that make you unique. And of course, be generous with yourself. You often have more experience than you might think when you start to break it down. Types of interview questions is the next topic. This was one of particular interest as we were prepping here and starting the presentation. I'm going to touch briefly on these types because these are pretty straightforward. Screening questions or general questions are exactly what they sound. Tell me about yourself. What is your greatest strength? What's your proudest moment? Things like that that are a little more general in kind of assessing your personality or your interest in the position. Be prepared for those. There are lists of them that are on the SuccessWorks website and will be on the resource document we have at the end of the presentation. The best way to prepare for those is just to practice. Technical questions are going to relate to your technical expertise, your hard skills, either in a software or a technical procedure. With those are where you might encounter more I don't know questions, and that's okay. Again, think about transferable skills or how you might address those technical competencies that you might need to improve on. Case study questions are like the example here. How would you create a lab procedure to gather new research data? With a case study question or procedural question, the interest is less in finding the correct answer from you and more in your thought process about how you got there. So think about how you did some of your success items and be ready to use those in case you come up with a case study question like this. The hardest questions, though, are the behavioral questions. Those that start out, tell me about a time when you solved a conflict with a coworker at work, or give me an example of a time when you had to meet a hard deadline. These questions can be kind of tricky because they're not typically how we talk to each other in conversation. There's a good method to approaching these, though. What a behavioral question is looking for is your response to a specific scenario, ideally something you've handled before. When you're asked these questions, typically what an employer is looking for is the STAR method. And that's a good way to frame your answers to these. STAR is an acronym. It stands for situation, task, action, and result. You're looking for a specific story in this case, something that will touch on, for example, a time you met a hard deadline. What was the specific situation of the deadline? What did you specifically have to do? What were your expectations? And then what did you actually do? What actions did you take? And then finally, what was the result? Be specific as you can. Again, this is like telling a story using this framework. So practicing with this can be a good way to be more comfortable with them. Right. Lots of questions in an interview, not all coming from the interviewer. You also want to make sure that you have questions prepared for the employer. An interview is where the employer decides if they want to hire you, but it's also where you decide if you would be happy accepting this job. As we said earlier in the chat, it's not going to be a good fit if you get the job and find out you'd be miserable there. So you find out if it's the right fit by asking questions. It's okay to ask, in an interview stage, you want to ask about the position and the job and the company itself, things addressing company culture, projects and duties, performance expectations, professional development and advancement opportunities, and it's okay also to ask about their hiring timeline. When do you think you'll make a decision? When can I hear back from you? Here are some examples of some questions, and there are more on the SuccessWorks website as well. And again, we'll have that link in the resources. What opportunities exist for professional growth? Asking about advancement in the organization, where you might see yourself in the future. What do you enjoy most about working for the company? Addresses company culture. But with that, you can find out what your interviewer thinks is really the cool things about the company. How do you define a successful performance on your team? Is the position expectations? What are you going to be expected to do in this job? And once you find out, the question to ask yourself is, are you okay with those? Questions to avoid at this stage, of course, basic information that you could find on your website, on the website. Don't want to put your foot in your mouth by asking something that was right there on the home page. And do your research and then ask questions that are a little more in-depth. Also, salary and benefits questions can wait until you have an offer. That's the very last stage of the interview process. And we do have information on our website about salary negotiations, which is good to review just in case the question does come up ahead of time. Finally, I want to touch on, well, one of the last things we'll touch on here, all the preparation and questions, finding the right webcam. It all boils down to knowing what you want out of the interview. Yes, the goal is to get a job, but you don't just want any job. You want the right job for you. So know what that job looks like when going into the interview. You can ask yourself these questions. What values, beliefs, and priorities are important to me? What do I want the interview to know about me? What makes me unique? What am I really proud of in my achievements? Why do you want this specific job and company? It seems a little bit reductive, but this question will come up in an interview, and you don't have to have an earth-shattering answer like I want to save the world through this job, but you should have an idea of why this job interests you so that you can communicate that to the employer. Finally, what questions do you need answered about this job? Are there deal breakers? Are there things that you aren't sure about that you need clarification on? It's okay to add, those are the things you want to clarify in the interview process. Devin's going to talk to us a little bit about interview follow-up here.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. So you just had your interview, you're feeling really good about it, you asked really thoughtful questions, now what? So after an interview, the last step in the process is to write a thank you note or email. This can maybe feel a little bit awkward as you maybe only spent a couple hours with your interviewers, but it is a really important step, and I promise you it'll leave a lasting good impression with the employers as well. We encourage you to try to send this note the same day as your interview or the day after. And if you have multiple interviewers that you're working with, we encourage you to try to write a personalized message for each individual. We'll kind of talk through a general formula for writing a thank you note, but please know you don't have to follow this exactly. Try to incorporate some of the elements, but we definitely encourage you to do what's most natural and comfortable for you. So in the first paragraph, you're going to want to thank the interviewer for the opportunity to meet with them. You can remind the individual of the date that you interviewed and what position you interviewed for. And this is one of the reasons that you want to send the note right after your interview. It's a lot less awkward to say, thank you for taking the time to meet with me today or yesterday, opposed to, 2 weeks ago, Wednesday the 5th, correct? So that's the first paragraph. The second paragraph, you're going to want to focus on 1 to 2 things you heard or discussed during your interview. And this will really reinforce the skills and experiences that you'll be able to bring to the organization. You can also use this space to remind the interviewer of some of your main qualifications or interview answers. Or if there was an interview answer that you didn't feel you were able to address as strongly during your interview, you could also follow up in this second paragraph. The third paragraph can feature, you can really bring out an aspect of the organization which you learned about during the interview, or something that you're most excited about. So this doesn't need to be anything major. It can be fun even, believe it or not. So if they mention they have, an office dog or like to do potlucks monthly, go ahead and include that. That's stuff that you can definitely talk about. Just make sure you tie it back to why you want to join the team. Lastly, the final paragraph, you'll thank the reader again for his or her time, and you'll indicate that you look forward to hearing from the employer about the outcome soon.
Excellent. All right. So the last thing we'll talk about here before we go to our Q&A session is formal communication. As with all things, through a job interview, through writing your resume, all those things, it's important to use our language to give the impression that you want people to carry with them after they meet you. Your communication will demonstrate your skills and your personality, so you should definitely allow your personality to be part of that. But here are some do's and don'ts to make sure that you make the best impression in an interview. Don't use jargon, acronyms, or slang terms. You want to avoid the interviewer not understanding what you're saying and then having to clarify. You want to keep the conversation flowing. So try to avoid things that are very specific or niche language. Try not to ramble or overshare. If you are the type that gets, when you get nervous, you kind of get talky, you can use the STAR method actually to compose 4-point answers to any question in an interview. Again, your goal in an interview is to hit specific answers and examples of your experience. So try to keep your answers to between 30 seconds to 2 minutes is a good rule of thumb. And again, use the STAR method to keep yourself on track if you're the type to go off the rails. Finally, don't get too chatty or friendly with the interviewer. It's good to make that personal connection, but remember, it's an interview, not a date. There'll be times to get to know your coworkers on a more personal level once you get the job. But for right now, focus on communicating your professional self. Things to do in an interview, though, especially in a video interview, ask questions or give reactions when appropriate to boost engagement. Use people's names. That really makes a big difference with connecting with the people you talk to. Make sure to use professional posture and body language. Sometimes with video interviews, we're giving the interview on the floor in the corner of our room, and that's okay. But do your best to communicate that professional posture and use body language that demonstrates the composed person that you want them to be and want them to know you as. And finally, stay focused on the screen. Remember, you're always live on a video call, so even if you're not speaking at the moment, focus on the call and don't get distracted by things off to the side. That's why it's good to silence your phone so it's not there to distract you. All right, so now we will bring in our alumnus. Alicia Willman is an HR recruiter and training coordinator at Sendik's Food Market in Milwaukee. She does a lot of hiring and for a lot of different kinds of positions and different people. So I brought her in today to give us the insider perspective on what it's like to interview in a virtual setting. If you have questions, how we're going to do this is I'd like you to raise your hand. There's at the bottom of the screen, there's a little symbol of a guy with his hand raised right next to the video and audio buttons. Go ahead and click that raise hand button if you have a question. We'll be moderating the questions. So what I'd like you to do is to either raise your hand or drop the question into the chat box, and we'll try to field them in order. If you raise your hand, if you'd like to ask audio. We'll use audio, but not video, please. So, Alicia, welcome, and why don't you give us a little bit of information about your history?
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, and thank you for having me here. So, Beth had said, I went to the UW as well, and I graduated College of Letters and Science with Communication Arts and Rhetoric, and then pretty much have spent most of my time within human resources, specifically within recruitment and training and development, and have worked in the Milwaukee area for quite some time now. And I love preparing people for interviews. I think for all of us, it's probably some of the more daunting tasks that we have after graduation. So being able to provide any insight and help that I can is wonderful.
Excellent. Thanks, Alicia. Thanks for taking your time to do this. We haven't had any questions come through just yet. So if you do have questions, again, either raise your hand if you'd like to talk about them, and or go ahead and drop your question in the chat box. Alicia, we'll start with some questions that I've prepared that are common here. We talked a little about situational questions. What makes a good answer to a situational question? What are interviewers looking to hear in those?
Yeah, absolutely. Really what interviewers want to know is that you have the ability to problem solve and use critical thinking skills in order to figure out a situation. I think the important thing in situational questions is not that it has to specifically relate to the job that you are either interviewing for or a job that you've had in the past, but more broadly in the fact of that you're able to work through problems to solve them for a positive outcome. I know sometimes it can get tripped up where maybe you haven't had an exact experience that relates to that position, but it's more about the content than anything else.
Awesome, thank you. I know that one can be a little tricky for people who aren't used to those questions. We did have a question before that got addressed, but I'd like to bring it up again. Would you, at the end of an interview, do you just ask for the interviewer's email to send that thank you note and do follow-up?
Yeah, fantastic. So what I always suggest doing is grabbing a business card. So typically, if you are in an in-person interview, someone will already give you a business card, usually when they're first meeting you. In a more virtual setting, you can just politely say that you would love to be able to follow up if there is an email address that would be best used. That way it can kind of broach the awkwardness of not having the business card, not having that face-to-face, but also not coming off a little too strong in that situation as well. So usually just asking if there's an email that is best used for follow-up communication.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like Tanner Dahlhauser has a question. Tanner, do you want to turn on your audio and go ahead and ask your question? Tanner, if your audio isn't working, you can always drop the question in the box too if you'd prefer. I don't think, oh, looks like he's reconnecting. When he comes back, we will, oh, maybe he's back. These are technical difficulties you might encounter in an interview, so it's good to see these live. Yeah. Hi, Tanner, go ahead and ask your question. Oh, okay. He's going to type it for us. Go ahead.
So what we can do real quick as far as like the backup for when we have technical difficulties, ideally you're trying to use some sort of laptop or desktop when you're in a virtual interview, but worst case scenario, 9 times out of 10 interviewers these days are using easy to access apps like Zoom and Google Meet. Sometimes they'll actually just use FaceTime. So just have your phone. So that way, if for whatever reason you're having issues with your laptop, you can always pop on your phone, have those apps downloaded. And then for me, I always just carry a set of earbuds. Sometimes, depending, like the room that I'm in right now is enclosed. Sometimes we don't get so lucky where we're in something that has a lot of echo. So just put your earbuds in to kind of reduce that echo situation as well. But I just always make sure that we have a couple options. So that way you can kind of move into one option to the other should something come up.
Sounds good. All right, here's Tanner's question. Could you elaborate how you have had to pivot recruiting and interviewing during the pandemic, and maybe 1 or 2 ways that we can adapt as virtual interviewers to make the best impression?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple ways of how we have changed recruiting and interviewing. The most change, obviously, first of all, going from in-person to virtual, but also it's a sensitive time to be asking people to work as well. So I think on our end, when we are actually going out there and seeking people, we're understanding that while we have an office, and maybe some people are comfortable working in an office, that you have looking for those remote opportunities, and that people have like technology in order to accommodate that. And that would be something that you can always ask about as well in that interview process. What does training look like now? So for example, there might be situations where you're interviewing for a position that the entire office is still working remote. Well, what does that training process look like if you're working remotely, if you're training remotely? And then of course, the interview process has changed as well. The interesting thing about virtual interviews is it's basically the combination of your phone interview and your in-person interview together. So I think with this presentation really outlined some of the best ways to make a good impression in the beginning, making sure that you're testing out your technology, that you're in a space that you're comfortable with. I completely agree that try to dress head to toe. I think it's very good for self-confidence. I think the biggest hurdle is the distraction aspect of it, or I think when it's less, it feels less professional. We just generally tend to relax a little bit. And I would say for sure to try to, with that best impression, making sure that we're still treating it as if that person's right in front of us. You still have your questions, you still have a way to be able to take notes. You've still done your research, but definitely minimize those distractions. If you have a phone, make sure that you silence it, and all that good stuff. I think getting used to talking towards the camera is another thing that we all just get used to from time to time. So making sure that we're not, again, staring straight off into space while we're talking to people. So those are the ways that I would say that you can make a really good impression when you're talking more virtually. And like I said, as far as recruiting goes, asking those questions as you're pivoting through a pandemic. What does training look like? Is the position have any opportunity for remote? If it's not remote, what steps are they taking in order to keep people safe while they're in the office? These are all things that you should, I would really encourage you to ask, and the employer should certainly have an answer for that. So that's an awesome question.
Excellent. Yeah, just like we talked about with the purpose of interviewer, asking questions in the interview, it helps you answer questions that you might have anxieties about and demonstrates interest in the process. So that's a great answer, Alicia. Thank you. Looks like Suresh, we have a couple questions in the chat, but I have also a request for Suresh Kundu would like to ask a question. Suresh, if you want to turn on your audio and go ahead when you're ready.
Awesome. Can people hear me?
Yes. Yeah, we can. Go ahead.
Awesome. So my question is about like when you're interviewing over the webcam, like what should be in your background or like what should not be in your background? And like, is it worth investing in like a green screen or is that like not necessary at all?
That's a good question. I think overall, what should it be in your background, as silly as it sounds, is like your bed. The idea is to give the impression that you're in some sort of professional, quiet space. I don't necessarily know that you can certainly invest in a more professional, like some of the background settings that were covered in the presentation. But if you have a space in your residence, or if you're comfortable, sometimes there are companies or libraries that will have spaces that you can interview in, but it's something that just isn't in a situation where there's lots of distractions, or I think for me, it's also so like if you are in a space, we want to make sure that you have something that has like a table on it, so that if you're on your phone, that you're not moving the phone around and having to reposition yourself. I don't think that there's any, like I said, as far as like what is in your background, I'm in a white background because I'm just in an office, but if you're in a kitchen or if you are in an office in your place or a study, I think all of those things are fine. I think the idea is just that you're not with something in your background that is overly distracting. And I know it sounds silly, but doing interviews from your bed is like a no. I don't want to see where the laptop is like facing up here because you're laying back. So that would be my answer to that.
Awesome. Thank you. I'll take a couple from the chat here.
Thank
Brianna asks, is there a good answer to give if they ask how soon you can start? She's been told in the past that it's not good to say as soon as possible. Can you help us break that myth? Tell us if it's true or not, and how you might better phrase that answer if there's a better way.
Yeah, so typically when people say as soon as possible, the reason why it's not a good idea is because you're not indicating that you would give notice to your other company. In a situation where you're moving, maybe you don't have another job right now because you're in school or preparing for school, typically just say that, I think someone actually answered in the chat, which is that I'm currently available to work. You can always give like 2 weeks, into about 2 weeks is when I am available. The reason that people kind of, it turns on just a light in someone's head is that saying as soon as possible means either you haven't given notice to your last job or you don't plan to give notice to your last job, which then cues in thoughts of, well, would you give notice to us? Should we want you to come start with us? So if you are not in that situation, you can just say that, I'm flexible to start whenever it is convenient for you.
Excellent. Here's an unusual one from Jay. Do the book is currently on your bedside table?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I will have to say yes, because I did an interview where someone did ask me that. So these are questions that are the probing personality questions. Some of them will also be like, if you were an app, what kind of app would you like to be? What are the best 3 books that you're currently reading, or like you said, your bedside table? What was something that was thought-provoking that you had in the last couple months? When was the last, these are questions that will probe more of your personality. If it's not already the very obvious ones where it's like, tell me some of your hobbies. So yes, be prepared in some way, shape, or form to answer a hidden personality question, but be honest, because if you honestly haven't read those books, that will come back to you. So if there is something where there's an app that you really do like, just be honest with whatever app that is, or whatever, like I said, whatever book that is, or whatever they're asking you. It's a personality question. There is no wrong answer. They're just trying to get to know you better.
Thanks, Alicia. We have a hand raised from Daniel. Daniel, why don't you go ahead and turn on your audio and give us your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good, cool. Yeah, I just had a few questions. So first one was like, if it's okay to like ask for feedback on how you did like after an interview, just like ask how you think they felt your performance was, and also like is there any like certain questions that you're looking out for like the interviewee to ask after an interview, and what are like interviewers looking for when they're looking through your like references that you provide?
Okay, those are really good questions. So I'll start with asking for feedback after an interview. The rule of thumb is that isn't always the best question to ask in those situations, mostly because can't always actually give you the feedback right then and there. I think that is a situation where based on a lot of just legality when it comes to employment law, we can't always just give the feedback in the interview process. If you're really looking for feedback, I think, like Beth said, SuccessWorks does an amazing job with being able to do those kind of mock interviews so that you can kind of learn how that works. An opportunity where you can ask for feedback is if the employer ended up moving in a different direction. That's typically where it's a little bit more acceptable to ask for that feedback. Sometimes the employer will be honest and say, give you that feedback, whatever that may be. Sometimes they might not be able to give it to you then either, or whatever that case might be in that situation. But generally speaking, after an interview, whether it's the first, second, or third, I would kind of refrain from asking that question. The other one of what kind of interview questions do we look for? I think someone actually put it in the chat, which I think is the absolute question that you should ask, is what does good or success look like in this role? I think that is a really telling question in an interview process. On one hand, it's going to let you know the actual like performance that they are looking for, the metrics, etc. But it'll also be an opportunity for you to ask a question, excuse me, not ask a question, for you to see if they have an answer for that question. Sometimes there are companies that maybe haven't fully fleshed out what they have as far as that position, what the expectations are. And so it's also an opportunity for you to really assess if this is the job that you would like to kind of go forward with. I think that is probably one of the biggest ones. I think the other one is, I personally like the question of like, what stands out the most for you in this company, or what do you like most about working here? What is the culture like there? So those would be good questions that I always look for. I think what you don't want to do is not have any questions. at least one or two questions just means that you've been engaged to the interview process. And like Beth has said, it's for both of you. It's not only that you are getting interviewed, but you're interviewing as well, because you want to make sure that whatever you have measured out as far as the points that you definitely want, the areas that you definitely want to see in your next job, you want to make sure that you're hitting on all of those in that interview process. And then what are employers looking for from your references? This varies. It kind of depends on what kind of references they end up calling. If they, if you indicate that you can call previous employers, they're typically just talking to the human resource team, which is usually just verifying that you actually were employed there. If they're actually calling like a managerial reference or a co-colleague reference, they're looking for like team attributes. So how well did you work with others? Were you collaborative? What were your strengths? What is something that you brought to the team? So those are going to be the things of just like, how did you get along with everyone? Some companies have actually skipped this. I'm not sure how much it will continue to skip during COVID, but we'll just actually bring you in for like a shadowing day. That way you get to meet the team and see how you interact instead of doing reference checks. So it varies to company of what they're looking for. I hope that helps. Those were good questions.
Yeah, it helped a lot. Thank you.
You bet.
So we're scheduled until 2 o'clock. We do have some overflow time. So I want to hit on, if you have questions, you can go ahead and throw them in the chat. We're going to get to Rosaline's question in just a second, but just in case people need to leave at 2 o'clock, I want to do our wrap-up coda, and then we'll go back to finishing up questions just for a little bit longer here. So don't forget to drop your question in the box if you have one. Just to kind of follow up with you, remember that SuccessWorks is available as your resource for preparing for interviews, as well as resumes, cover letters, etc. I mentioned it earlier, but I'll say it again too. If you want practice mock interviewing or talking through some of your interview questions, go to SuccessWorks website and make an appointment with one of our advisors. We all specialize in a particular career area, so you can pick one that matches your interests, and we can help you talk through those interview questions. We're also going to drop some links in the chat box here. We'd love to have you take our survey to let us know how our workshop went. And then we're also going to put a link in the chat box for some additional resources that we discussed today. Some of these are going to be our website. Others are just kind of tips and follow-ups. So keep an eye out for those coming into the chat box shortly. Let me go back to the question that we had up above here. So we'll go back and finish the questions here. Rosaline asked, what would you recommend to do before receiving authorization for employment? Alicia, I don't know if you deal with employment authorizations in your position. Can you tell us about that if you have?
So we do. That is tough. It kind of depends on where you are in the situation. No, you said, should I start looking for jobs after receiving the receipt? I would say don't hesitate to get started. Develop your resume, do the interviews, apply for jobs. If you are in the process of being able to work in the US and getting that authorization in process, there are several ways that companies will work through that process with you. I wouldn't let it hinder you in that situation, but I would also be upfront about it so that that company can make the decision to work with you in that situation. But I wouldn't say to wait, especially now with everything that's going on. I would say that getting out there and being transparent is going to be more beneficial than waiting at this time.
Excellent. Here's a follow-up from Rosaline again. How should I address that I haven't gotten authorization for employment in the interview?
Yeah, so it will actually probably prompt you in the application process if you will need sponsorship. And that would be an opportunity in where you can indicate that, or I would also indicate that in the application process, they'll have options for like additional documents or additional things that you want to include. You can do that in a cover letter, and then at that process, they can continue to go through that with you at that point.
Sounds good. And the form I-766 is the EAD form. So once you have that, you should be authorized for employment. If you have questions about authorization, as a student, definitely take those to the ISS. They can help you answer those as well. Thanks, Alicia.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions here? It looks like we might have addressed all the questions. Oh, here's one more. Does SuccessWorks offer resources for preparing for grad school interviews? That we can answer. The answer is yes. We can help talk to you about prepping for grad school, prepping your resume, your application materials, and practicing the interview process. Sometimes the questions are a little different, and it can help to kind of, again, have some practice to frame your answers to that, to best display what you want the grad school interviewers to know about you. So definitely feel free to make that appointment with us if you do want to talk about prepping for grad school interviews. Thanks, Paige. I will call out for final questions. Anybody else? Sounds like we might be done for real this time. So Alicia, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. Your insight into the field is really helpful to get that insider perspective on what it actually is like to interview in practice. Is there anything that you'd like to share with us as a final note?
I think if anything, my one takeaway would be it is best to be as genuine as possible in these interviews, whether they're virtual or in person. Be yourself, be confident in the things that you have done in school and outside of school, and do not hesitate to cast a wide net when applying for jobs, and get as much practice as possible.
Awesome. Thank you so much again. And thank you to all of our participants today. You had great questions, and I'm really excited that you're all thinking ahead about interviewing and preparing for us. Again, don't forget about SuccessWorks. Come to us if you have any questions about grad school, interviews, jobs, student employment, anything like that. We're here to help you talk about your career journey. Our website is successworks.wisc.edu. And I will leave the room here open a little longer for anyone who would like to have any final questions. But I will turn off the recording now.